In this video, we are going to learn about domain and range. We've talked about domain and range a little bit already this school year when we're looking at like a discrete graph or a table of values or mapping. But when we have continuous graphs, the domain and range is a little bit different. And this is when we're going to use our interval notation. It's very important that you ask all of the questions that you have with this stuff because we are going to be using domain and range for the rest of the school year. So right now we're learning about linear functions. We're going to do domain and range again when we learn about exponential functions, and we'll do it again when we talk about quadratic functions. So if you have questions, please pause the video and ask those questions. It looks a little bit tricky and confusing, but I promise you the more the questions that you ask and the more you practice it, the easier it will become. So let's go ahead and get started. It says, how do I find the domain and the range of a graph? The domain is your x values from least to greatest. So an easier way of thinking about that is that your domain is your x values from left to right. And you're going to hear me say that a whole bunch the rest of the school year. So domain is your x values from left to right. Your range is your y values from least to greatest. Another way that you could think about it is your range is your y values from the bottom of your graph to the top of your graph. And that's the way that you're going to write it. So let's try these. On this first example right here, I have the graph of this line, and we want to write the domain. Your domain are your x values from left to right. The furthest point to the left is this point right here, right? I can't go any further left than this point. There is nothing else over here for this line. So my furthest point to the left is this point right here. What is my x value here? My x value is 0. Right? Because this point right here is the point 0, -1. This is x and this is y. So your x value is 0. And then I want to find my furthest point to the right. Well, my furthest point to my right is an arrow. An arrow means that I am going to the right forever. So I'm going to keep going this way forever, and it's never going to stop. Well, if it's going this way forever, where is it going? It's going to infinity. So my domain from left to right is from 0 to infinity. 0 was at a closed circle, so 0 gets a bracket. Infinity always gets a parenthesis. So that's how you write that in interval notation, from 0 to infinity. As an inequality, well, your domain is always your x values every time. And then we start here at 0, and then we're going to the right forever. So everything is greater than 0. So this is going to be greater than or equal to 0. I know it's greater than because it's going higher. I know that it's equal to because I have a bracket. So you need to think back to what we learned earlier in this unit. If you have greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, those are going to be brackets. If you have a less than or greater than, that's going to be parentheses. Now that we've talked about the domain, let's look at the range. Your range are your y values from the bottom of your graph to the top of your graph. The bottom of my graph is this point right here. So the bottom of my graph is where y is -1. because that's that point right there. The top of my graph is also where this arrow is. This arrow is telling me that my graph is going up forever. If this graph is going up forever, then that means that it is going to positive infinity. So my range from the bottom of my graph to the top of my graph is from -1 to infinity. -1 gets a bracket because it was a closed circle. Infinity always gets a parenthesis. As an inequality, your range is always your y values, and then everything is bigger than -1 because it's going up. So this is going to be y is greater than or equal to -1. Again, it's greater than because we're going up. It's equal to because it had a bracket. Now I know that's a little bit weird the first time you see it. We are going to look at a couple other examples. Definitely ask questions if you need help, but maybe look at the next example first, see if it starts to click, and then start asking your questions. We're going to do the same exact process for this next one. Your domain are your x values from left to right. My graph is going to the left forever. If it's going to the left forever, that means it's going to negative infinity, because my x values are going to keep going negative forever, and it's going to keep going this way forever, so that's going to negative infinity. My graph is going to the right forever, so that's going to positive infinity. I know that because if this graph keeps going to the right forever, my x values are going to get larger and larger and larger, and it's going to keep going that way forever. So my domain is from negative infinity to positive infinity. Negative infinity to positive infinity means that you're including all of the numbers that you currently know. So another way of saying this is all real numbers. Mathematicians don't like to write a lot, and so they come up with a lot of symbols to be able to write things faster. So instead of having to write out all real numbers, you could use this symbol right here. It is a capital R with an extra line. So again, to draw that, you just draw an R and then use an extra line. So that is the symbol for all real numbers. Again, it's a capital R with an extra line. Your range is your y values from the bottom of your graph to the top of your graph. Well, the bottom of my graph, that's pointing down, so that's going down forever, so that's going to negative infinity. The top of my graph, well, that's pointing up forever, so that's going to positive infinity. So my range is from negative infinity to positive infinity. Negative infinity to positive infinity includes all of the real numbers, so we could say all real numbers. Let's look at the next one. Here we have this graph that kind of looks like part of a trapezoid, and we're going to do the same exact steps. Here we're looking for your domain. Your domain are your x values from left to right. My furthest point to the left is this point here. This, let me grab my red highlighter, is where x is what number? Well, here x is -3. My furthest point to the right is this point right here. And this is where x is +4. So my domain from left to right is from -3 to +4. -3 gets a bracket because that's a closed circle. +4 gets a bracket because that's a closed circle. Whenever you are in between two numbers and neither of those numbers are infinity, you're going to use our compound inequality notation. So we'll have -3 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to 4. This is always the notation that you'll use when you're in between two numbers. Your inequality symbol is always less than. And then I know it's equal to because I had a bracket. If I had parentheses, then I would just have less thans and no equal tos. So again, they're equal to because of the brackets. Your range are your y values from the bottom of your graph to the top of your graph. The bottom of my graph are both of these points here. They're both the same level. So my bottom of the graph is where y is 0. The top of my graph is this section up here, and that is where y is, let's see, 1, 2, 3. So my range from the bottom of my graph to the top of my graph is from 0 to 3. 0 gets a bracket because they were both closed circles, and then 3 gets a bracket because 3 is a solid line. As an inequality, this is going to be 0 is less than or equal to y is less than or equal to 3. Again, it's that same notation that we talked about up here. You always use less than when you're in between two numbers when neither one of them is infinity. And both of these are equal to because both of these were brackets. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can do this last one on your own. So your domain are your x values from left to right. The furthest point to the left of this graph is this point right here. This is where x is -2. The furthest point to the right is this point right here. This is where x is 3. So my domain from left to right is from -2 to 3. -2 gets a bracket because it is on a solid line. 3 gets a bracket because it is on a solid line. So as an inequality, this would be -2 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to 3. For my range is my y values from the bottom of my graph to the top of my graph. The bottom of my graph is this point right here. This is where y is -3. The top part of my graph is this point right here. This is where y is, let's see, 1, 2, 3. So my range from the bottom of my graph to the top of my graph is from -3 to +3. -3 gets a bracket because it is on a solid line. +3 gets a bracket because it is on a solid line. As an inequality, my range would be -3 is less than or equal to y is less than or equal to 3.